You know, we all need to have a rule of prayer. And in monasteries, it's that the program, as it were, of the monastery is contained primarily in the rule. Of course, in the monastery, generally they also have daily liturgical services, the full cycle of services that are pretty much where the monastics are pretty much expected to be at all the services, but that's only one part of the rule of prayer. Right? And in parishes, everybody's expected to be at both vigil and liturgy on Sunday. And of course, in some parishes, especially in the Old World, they do a full daily cycle of services, or at least matins and vespers. Matins in the morning, vespers in the evening. And that's really the basic job of the priest, is to make sure that the services are done and that the church is open for people to come into. And in parishes, sometimes the liturgy is served every day, but mostly only in cathedrals and in large monasteries. When I go to Moscow, one of my absolute favorite things, if I'm staying at the Danilov Hotel, which is on the property of the Danilov Monastery or adjacent to it, is to sneak over for their 7 a.m. liturgy. And it's just wonderful because it's dark, it's very simple, it's 1 hour long, it's beautifully sung, quickly but beautifully, without rushing, and it moves. And I was really shocked one day. I was there for that liturgy, and it was a Soul Saturday, which means, you know, the commemoration of the departed, lots and lots and lots of names and things. It was and there were like 400 people at the liturgy, but it was still an hour long, even with all the communicants. So that was a beautiful thing. So the liturgical cycle, the weekly liturgical cycle, is only part of a rule of life, a rule of prayer that we should have as Orthodox Christians. The meat of it is what we do at home and what we do on a daily basis. And there are some people that have very highly developed rules of prayer. Some lay people, but one of the things is you'll never know. Only their father confessor knows for sure, because it's the custom in the Orthodox Church not to talk about your personal rule of prayer to anybody except your father confessor. So there are some people who have a 2-hour rule of prayer or more every day, and it's a pretty awesome thing, you know, and it'll include the Psalter. It may include some of the liturgical services. It may include the readings from the Scriptures. It would include the daily prayers, and so it's it can be a very complex thing. Of course, this also fits in with the rules for fasting and feasting. Now, we all know, and especially as Americans, we know about rules for fasting. That we kind of get. But one of the things that we don't get is the rules for feasting. And that's something equally important, because the calendar and the fasts and the feasts and the levels of the various feasts, and it all gives substance to the life. It's not just a repetition of the same thing again and again and again and again and again every day. And even if you do the entire liturgical cycle as a rule of prayer, as part of your rule of prayer, it repeats once every 72 years. That's a pretty long cycle. Most people don't get through more than 1.5. Most women, we're lucky if we get through one, you know. But part of that rule is the feasts, the fasts, the liturgical prayers as far as possible, And within that is also the Divine Liturgy, going to communion, and preparation for communion. It used to be that people would only, back in the days of the Russian Empire, in just the 19th century, and then some carry over into the 20th century, especially in Rokor, but also in other churches, Greek and Serbian and so forth. The people would only go to communion once or twice a year. They'd go once during Great Lent, and then maybe on their name's day. And in fact, the practice got so bad to the point where some priests would do a dry liturgy, where there's no bread, no wine. It's an empty chalice. He comes out and does the holy pirouette. You know, the fear of God with faith and love draw near, and goes back in. You saw that.
I saw that.
Yeah. Bad practice. Very bad practice. If I was that priest bishop, I'd suspend him. Actually.
Where was this?
Where was that recently? That was actually at Jordanville. That wasn't a dry liturgy, I'm sure.
It wasn't a dry liturgy, but he just walked out, did a pirouette, and walked back in. And
Right. Yeah. So, a dry liturgy, I would suspend the priest. A liturgy with no apparent communicants, that's just a different story. And the priest, when you were there, didn't realize that there were any communicants.
There was a reason for that. You have to have been to the Vespers service the night before, and I went to the Vespers service at St. Elizabeth, and he didn't know it.
Mm-hmm.
So, therefore, he didn't even consider that I was ready.
And you probably had to go to confession.
No, they didn't require that. The thing is, you have to. They have the strict rule. You have to have attended the service the night before. But you can go to St. Elizabeth, but he needs to know it.
Yeah.
So it was my fault.
So, but unfortunately, that holy pirouette, as it were, with the chalice, is something that happened in a lot of Orthodox churches in a lot of places, and it's because people's level of piety was it was completely non-Eucharistic. They valued the Eucharist so much that they regarded it as too special to take very often. And so people would go through a long and complex period of preparation, of intense fasting for a whole week, for example, and saying all the prayers, the three canons, and the akathist, and the and being absolute xerophagy, which is a type of fasting where it's dry, which is called dry eating, means absolutely no oil, nothing that's anything other than kind of raw vegetables, nothing cooked. So, and it varies. It varied in places. Some places that was 7 days. Some people it was 3 days. But it was completely unrelated to the church's calendar and its cycles of feasting and fasting. And the whole point of the calendar and its daily feasts and fasts, in other words, or the weekly feasts and fasts, if nothing else, Wednesday and Friday as fast days. Sunday is always a feast day. Saturday actually is always a feast day in its own way, even during Great Lent. And the other days can be strict fasting days as well. That whole cycle of especially of the fasting and the prayers was intended by the church as a personal, and the services as the personal role of prayer, which prepared one to go to communion on the weekend, if not every day during the week. It used to be that the pre-sanctified liturgy would be served every day during Great Lent. and the other fasts. There was even a time when the pre-sanctified liturgy would be served on Wednesdays and Fridays in regular time. It's just communion, because pre-sanctified liturgy is basically Vespers with communion as the kind of culmination to a day of fasting. So all sorts of things go into this whole mix. So as we look at it, the development of a rule of life, we have to take the fasting, we have to take the prayers, we have to take the liturgical prayers, we have to take going to confession and going to communion into account as part of this. Now, in America, where the church has become greatly secularized to a great degree, especially in some of the bigger jurisdictions, the Greeks, the Antiochians, the OCA. Whereas the elderly people might observe, this very kind of strict discipline as an echo of the past, a lot of the younger people don't. And so the fasting is minimized, and the prayers of preparation are minimized, and there was a whole kind of movement that actually I believe was quite necessary to restore people going to communion. But it kind of went too far, and so people would show up sometime during the liturgy and just march up to the chalice without any preparation. And it's one thing in a smaller church where the clergy know everybody, but if you have one of these huge Greek churches, for example, where there may be 1,500 people show up and one priest, he's certainly not going to be able to hear many confessions. And there's also another practice where a lot of Greek priests don't hear confessions. When I was newly ordained, there was this little old Greek lady in the parish she was like 75 years old. She was baptized in the Orthodox Church and grew up in New Hampshire, in one of the huge Greek communities up there. And she said to me, "I've been going to church every day, every Sunday, and going to communion every Sunday for the past 75 years, and they always taught us that the difference between the Catholics and the Orthodox is that Catholics had to go to confession and the Orthodox didn't, and I've never been to confession, and I'm not going to start now."
You got a good invitation to that,
And here I am, right, a baby priest, right? 2 years, less than 2 years a priest. And here's this old lady, who's been Orthodox twice as long as I've been alive. And though actually she did actually break down and start coming to confession. But there was a practice in the Greek Orthodox Church, coming all the way back from the part of the history of the Greek Church, where during the Ottoman yoke, or the Turkish yoke, there was no theological education. Anybody who wanted to get a Christian theological education had to go abroad, which usually meant either Catholic or Protestant. And so that created all sorts of problems. So they would take the most pious men who could read something, somewhat, in a parish or a village, and ordain him a priest. And so he could get through the services, but he didn't know anything else. And the bishops would not permit him to hear confessions, because he wasn't had absolutely no kind of spiritual formation or education. And they would have priest monks from who had been educated and formed in the monasteries would go around. There would be a father confessor in each diocese. Well, there may be 20 or 30 or 50 parishes in each diocese, so he would get around to each parish about once or twice a year. You know, and people wouldn't go to the next village to go to confession. You go to your church and go to confession. So, so people in the Greek tradition, many got out of the habit of going to frequent confession because it just wasn't there. Now what I don't know in that practice is whether the only time that those people would, and my guess is, the only time those people would go to communion is when that priest monk was there. And they'd go to confession and they'd go to communion. And they'd wait until he showed up again the next time, the next year probably, to go to confession and communion without, you know, regardless of where it was in the liturgical cycle or anything else. Now in the monasteries, it's different. And one of the things that's very important to understand is how intimately related the spiritual life and the kind of rule of spiritual life is for Orthodox Christians, for lay Orthodox Christians, with the monasteries. The monasteries have always been, at least for the past 1700 years, kind of example. They've kind of set the example of piety that the lay people would try and follow. Now some do, and some did, and some didn't, and you know, there have always been people who didn't pay any attention, and there have always been people who were very pious. But the monasteries, and so you take a village in Greece, or you take a village in Russia, it probably was nearby a monastery someplace. So the people would go to their village church for the services during the week. In fact, as recently as 300 or 400 years ago in Russia, people would go to church every day. In fact, even twice a day, in the morning and the evening. They go to church in the morning before going out in the field to work, and they go stop at Vespers before going home for dinner. And so the life of the church formed their, kind of put bookends on the day, which is how it operates in the monasteries. You go to church in the morning, then you work, and then there may be a little service in the middle of the day, but then you go to Vespers in the evening, and that kind of ends the work day and gets you ready for the evening. And it sanctifies the day. That's the whole point. It sanctifies the day. And you begin to see, especially in a monastery, how work is something holy and sacred, and it's not divorced from spiritual life. In fact, your work is part of your spiritual life, and how you work is part of your spiritual life. All of this then relates to having the personal rule of prayer. Oh, for the people living in the village, they go to their parish church, and then maybe on feast days, and certainly the feast day of the monastery, they would go to the monastery on pilgrimage. Some would go for baptisms, depend on where you are.
The weddings at the church and the baptisms at the monastery.
Yeah, in Russia, monasteries are forbidden to do baptisms.
Wow.
Except for people who are joining.
But not babies?
No. No, it's very unusual. and because that's deemed it's part of the income of the parish priests.
Oh.
Yes.
Even right now?
Probably.
I'm not sure. I was young that time, but I think I remember how my father got baptized when in a monastery.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not become a monk.
No. Well, there are different practices in different places, but in many places, well, in general, the rule is that the norm for like these personal sacraments, as it were, the sacraments of sanctification of life, baptism, marriage, funeral, are not done in monasteries. They're done in parish churches.
I couldn't imagine that, because in Greece that's the main income.
Yeah.
For the monastery, they have no other income.
Yeah, not in the Russian tradition. So it varies. It varies from place to place. Now, in the old Russian tradition, there's a book called the Domostroy from the 17th century, and it's quite interesting. And it talks about how do you do a Christian home, and so it tells you about the feasting and the fasting and how many prostrations, which is like 400 a day, that you're supposed to do together as a family. How often you're supposed to beat your wife, how you're supposed to beat your children, all these kinds of, essential pieces of information, which, thank God, have passed into the historical memory. But it gives an idea. There's a story about St. Sergius of Radonezh. You might know it. He was a little kid at 6 years old who was having trouble learning how to read. And this wandering elder came by and he invited him to come to his home. And it was the family's custom to read the Psalms before the meal. And so St. Sergius, by the blessing of the elder, went from not being able to read anything to being able to read the Psalms. It was a house probably structured by something like the Domostroy. But it used to be that families would have very extensive prayer rules together. They would do compline together, they would do canons and acathists and the Jesus prayer and prostrations and as part of the daily rule. Now, today, there are all these elements that are floating around, and some people, and we're free to use them or not use them, according to the rule that you arrive at with your spiritual father. One of the biggest temptations is to take on too much. So you initially set the rule, oh, I'm going to read the morning and evening prayers. And then you feel like it's not long enough. And so you add canons and you add acathists, and pretty soon you're late for work. And pretty soon you're not getting enough sleep. And you're falling asleep on the job and you can't sustain it, and so you just quit. And that's the great danger. And so, for example, in a normal Russian Orthodox prayer book, you have the morning prayers and you have the evening prayers, and then all the rest of the material that you can use is later on in the book. But that's a basic rule. Now, many places, many monasteries in particular, and many spiritual fathers will also assign a certain number of prostrations with the Jesus prayer, for example. So they may give some places, the Greeks are more into prostrations, I think, than the Russians now. Greek monasteries in particular tend to be big on prostrations. They may be half prostrations, but they're still kind of, and they may be 100 or 200, and it's kind of like done real quick. And usually with the Jesus prayer. Then there are the prayers of intercession, where you remember people that you want to pray for who are sick, or your family who you love, or those who've departed. And on top of that comes the rule of preparation for Holy Communion. So there's the daily prayer rule. And we can go more into that later if you want. The rule of preparation, prayer rule of preparation for communion, which goes along with keeping the Wednesday and Friday fasts and being watchful over yourself in particular, and going to confession as preparation for communion, is actually doable on a weekly basis. It's not an overwhelming thing. It seems overwhelming at first. And that's in addition to the daily rule of morning and evening prayers. You do 3 canons and an akathist, plus the canon before communion and the prayers before communion. And you can do them all at once the night before, or in the morning if you get up early before you go to church. Probably not before an 8 o'clock liturgy. 10 o'clock, it's a little more doable. But there's this rule that's prescribed. And there are actually prayer books that Jordanville publishes, for example, that have the 3 canons and the akathist all laid out. So you don't have to be flipping pages between, because there's a certain way canons are put together when you read several of them at once. Now, one of the big differences is that between, say, doing this rule before communion and, say, going to the service of matins, is that people didn't understand matins. It's going on in a foreign language. If it's, and it doesn't matter if it's in Greek, it's still in a foreign language if you're speaking Greek, because it's ancient Greek. And Russian and Slavic churches, it's in Slavonic. Well, at least with the daily, the 3 canons and the akathists, it may still be in Slavonic, but it becomes so familiar that you understand it. Whereas the other goes by, lickety-split in church. But what is the usual formula for matins? It's 3 canons. So it's like you're doing double matins. Now, so if you've been to Vigil and then you read the 3 canons and the akathist, it's almost like half of matins again. But that's all right, because what it does is it immerses you into the material, and that's good. That's good. Because the idea is not simply to get through the rule and read it as fast as you possibly can. The idea is to enter into the words of the prayer, to enclose your mind in the words of the prayer, as St. Ignatius Grancinino says, so that when you say the prayers before communion, when you say the morning and evening prayers, that you're really praying it, and not just glancing at it or skimming it or reading through it as fast as you can because you really want to watch the show that's coming on at 10 o'clock.
Enclose yourselves.
Enclose your mind in the words of the prayer.
Words of the prayer.
And the three canons consist, usually, there are different collections. St. Tikhon's also has a little prayer book with the three canons all put together, but no akathist, which is kind of odd. They use the canon of repentance, the supplicatory canon to the Mother of God, and the canon to the guardian angel. The Jordanville usage is the canon to the sweetest Lord Jesus, the supplicatory canon to the Mother of God, the prophecies, and canon to the guardian angel. The Valam usage is it's a canon to Jesus. It's the akathist canon to the Mother of God, and canon to the guardian angel. There's some, there's some combination, and you can vary it. Then the akathist is either the akathist to Christ or the akathist to the Mother of God. Now, the monastery in Russian monasteries, the three canons and akathist is the daily rule of prayer for monks. That's the core of the daily rule. And and I'm horribly guilty of this, but there was one monk that I knew, Father Melchizedek of Optina, and he went to the elder because he made a tape of the rule. And of course, we didn't have CDs, and he goes up to him and says, Elder, can I play the tape of the rule while I'm driving? And the elder said, yes, and your tape player will be saved, but you won't. Of course, I'm afraid that I make use of the audio CD lots. It beats swearing at the other drivers. Puts one in a much better state of mind to go to communion. Now, in addition to that, there's the canon of preparation for communion, which is 3 Psalms, 22, 23, and I forget the third one. Some Troparia, and then this short canon of preparation before the 10 prayers of preparation. Now, there are various collections of these prayers. There's your kind of standard Russian collection, which is basically very similar to your kind of standard Greek collection, which you can find in the Transfiguration prayer book. But one of the best prayer books on the market, and with the best English and the most beautiful translations, is the Old Believer books. Old Believer prayer book from Erie, Pennsylvania, from the Old Rite Rocor Church up there. The translations are outstanding. They're fluent, whereas some of the other translations are not fluent. And they're poetic. So it's very nice. It's kind of interesting that you get the Old Believers putting out some of the best editions of the English language liturgical books. They have a liturgy book coming out, which I'm looking very much forward to seeing. Of course, it has the Old Rite liturgics, rubrics as well. In that book, which is a 17th century monastic prayer book, essentially, from before 1667, you find 20 prayers of preparation for Holy Communion, some of which are much longer and very beautiful and very compunctionate and kind of more even and spiritually more elevated. has everybody seen an Old Believer prayer book?
Yeah.
I think they got it for sale downstairs. They used
Yeah,
to.
I think
The one from
yeah.
Erie, Pennsylvania?
Yeah.
Oh,
Where? You seen it?
downstairs.
It's kind of a long format.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
And thick. But it's very nice. That also has a whole section in it on how to conduct a prayer rule and how to. It has all the Old Believer instructions for making the sign of the cross, which is like this, and using the listovka, which is a kind of a forerunner of the chotki, the prayer rope. Only it's made out of leather.
Oh.
Yeah. So that's some of the monks at Jordanville have them. But that was commonly used up through like the 18th century in Russia.
What's it called?
Listovka. So.
Where would one purchase one of those?
Online.
Hello?
Online.
Listovka?
Listovka, Lestovka.
Thank you.
But a regular prayer book works just as well. Now there's another aspect of a prayer rule, and in fact, in many places, or in some places anyway, at least for certain, especially certain monasteries, especially for monks who have attained to a certain level of spiritual maturity, there's more and more less and less emphasis on the prayer books than there is on the Jesus prayer, and the Jesus prayer becomes central. Because when it really comes down to it, what's the content of all those prayers? Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, right? So in the Athonite usage, the standard rule of prayer for a full monk is 1,200 Jesus prayers. That's kind of your daily minimum. You can go beyond that, but it's 1,200. And in most places, the prayer is done silently or quietly in one's own cell, sometimes with prostration, sometimes not. And the Jesus prayer can come to replace all these other prayers, except, of course, the liturgical prayers. But, for example, at the monastery of St. John the Baptist in Essex, it even replaces the daily cycle of services. And they sit for 2 hours in the darkened church, morning and evening, and do the Jesus prayer. And it's very intense. Very, very intense. One of the things about the prayer book prayers is it keeps your mind busy. And then you've got the church with the icon lamps and the icons and people moving around and all of this stuff. I was listening to the ladies talk the other day, and it seems like in the altar I'm pretty kind of focused. I have to wonder what the altar boys are doing and who's going to light who on fire next. But evidently outside there's this whole little sideshow, especially of the little ones, who are parading around and making a scene. Yeah, it's kind of cute and that's fine. Holy noise.
Very active yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to. The last thing you want is a church that's full of people with white hair and is perfectly silent. It sounds like a tomb to me. But in the monastery, it's a different story, and because the people who come there are looking for and who live there especially, are looking for a context of stillness in which to be able to really enter into the prayer without a need for distraction. Very often we have a need to be distracted because it gets too much sometimes. And I always remember when I first started the monastery in Point Reyes, being zealous young guys, we started out doing the full cycle, which meant matins was 2.5 hours long in the morning, and so I went to Russia to my spiritual father and kind of laid everything out. And he said, "Matins? Why are you doing matins? Matins is for big monasteries. You're barely even a little skeet. Forget matins. Do the Jesus prayer for an hour and serve liturgy." Unfortunately, we'd already gotten it established, and so it's kind of hard to go back. But it would have been too intense, for a bunch of young guys to go immediately into a context of the Jesus prayer for a full hour in silence. A bunch of 20-year-olds. And it is very intense. Now, if you have older people, more mature people, monks there who are, who can kind of create the context, the younger guys can enter into it. But in Russia, in the monasteries, at least at Valom, novices are forbidden to use the Jesus prayer. They're not. They have to get to know the prayer book prayers. They have to get to know the daily rule of the 3 canons and the Akathist. They're preoccupied with their life confessions and getting all of that together. And then once they've become monks, then they're given a prayer rope and taught the Jesus prayer. One of the things that's very important about the Jesus prayer is that if you engage in it, if you engage it very intently and intensely, it's profoundly spiritually active. And what happens is that it allows you to create space in your heart for God to work. Because your mind is occupied with the words of the prayer, and actually eventually the words of the prayer just kind of merge into silence, into a kind of an intention. And a kind of active receptivity to God. And God works in your soul. Well, if you have not been purified, if you haven't gone through the fires of purification and gotten rid of all of your resentments and all the memories of everything, you sit in silence for a few minutes and you're going to go nuts. Because every image that you've ever seen, every person that's ever hurt you, everything that's ever happened in your life is going to come into your mind. Usually at the most inappropriate moments. It may not come while you're praying, but it'll come, for example, like some scene from a war movie passing in front of your eyes. I mean, this is personal. When you're consecrating the gifts, it's like, where did that come from? With blood flying all over it's like, so all the movies, everything from the internet, everything you've ever seen, it's all in there. And part of the whole process of the spiritual life is to purify your mind, which partly means to confess what needs to be confessed and to get rid of all of that stuff. But it also means to bring your mind under control so that you can you can ignore the images and the thoughts and the ideas and the words and the concepts and all of this, the chatter of your subconsciousness, so that you can actually be silent and go into deep silence. And it's a silence that permeates all the way down into the center of your heart. Now, this is from a mature practice of the prayer. And so that's what's happening with people. For example, at Essex, when they're doing the gist, they're not thinking about what's for dinner and how to translate this or that, hopefully, but entering into that deep stillness, or what people are, the monks are doing when who have a mature practice of the prayer. They're in deep inner stillness, and God is active. Because prayer is not about what you say to God, it's what God does in you.
Valdika, so could you also put it like bringing your mind under God's control?
Yep. But it's also under your control.
Right.
And
so it's like a reciprocity kind
yeah, it's cooperation.
Hmm.
Cooperation, synergy. Now this practice is called hesychasm, and that's the technical name for the spiritual discipline of Mount Athos and Orthodox spirituality in general. For the most part, it's about this practice of stillness, hesychia, which means silence or stillness.
So I thought for some reason that in my head that you had to say it out loud. So do you normally say it quietly or?
Well, at Essex, there's one person that says it out loud, and then they hand off the rope around. And so I think, and they have a certain number of ropes that count out.
But when you're by yourself?
No, it's more like 6 or 7.
Yeah, but they go, it's not one at a time, they do 300 and 300 and 300, so it's like
Yeah.
900.
900, yeah.
But when you're alone, is it better to say it out loud or quietly? Does it make a difference?
Well, you can start out loud and then it becomes more quiet. You don't have to say it out loud, no. After a while, it'll become more and more quiet. And then it moves from, because basically the prayer rope is there to kind of keep track, partly. It's got a certain number of knots, and you keep track of how many laps you've gone around the rope. It doesn't take much kind of conscious thought. If you've got a prayer rope with 300 knots, it really doesn't take much to keep count. That's 1, 2, 3, So, but eventually, this, especially for hermits, the Jesus prayer completely replaces both the liturgical cycle as well as any prayer book prayers. Now there's another practice which is used in Russia and which is a wonderful practice. It's similar to the Rosary. It's the prayer, the Orthodox version of the Hail Mary. Rejoice, O Virgin Theotokos, Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. Blessed is the fruit of thy womb, for thou hast borne the Savior of our souls. And that's done 150 times. Now at Divevo, which is where that is the rule of the monastery, the nuns take a walk around the entire complex on this path and say the rule together. And one lap around, it's a huge monastery, one lap around the monastery is enough to do the whole rule. They stop every so often and say the Lord's Prayer. Which is the same discipline as the Rosary, basically. Only there's no meditation on the mysteries and things like that. So, what should we do? You know, basically. The idea is to pray as you can. Not how much you feel like, but as you can, as you're able. And we're usually able to do a little more than we think we can. But we also want to make it a reasonable rule so that we can stick with it and do it every day. You know, some days we'll feel like doing more. Some days we may not feel like doing the whole thing. That means maybe it's a little too long. But the idea is that we find a rule that's going to work for us, where and we start slow, and that we're going to keep up, and we're going to do every day, morning and evening. Here again, the idea is not simply to do the rule to keep the discipline. The idea is to pray, and to really pray, and to have conscious contact, conscious awareness of God, to connect, in other words. Because we can all just you know, stand there, read the book, and you know, be thinking about what's for breakfast, or what was it at dinner that gave me a stomach ache, you know. But it's much better to be able to be focused on God and to pray using the words, either the words of the book or our own words, or the Jesus prayer, to actually be praying to and having, in other words, having a relationship with God. And you know, it's not. We can fall into a kind of formalistic practice, but that's really not what it's about. Now, there's another story that comes to mind. There was this nun who came to this elder who was living in he was living in exile, kind of, instead of the Gulag. He was in internal exile during the Soviet period. And he was a great man of prayer. And this nun came to him and said, "I do 10,000 Jesus prayers every day." And he said, "Oh, that's nice. Now, I challenge you to do 100 with complete attention." And she came back and said, "I can't do it. Can't do it." Because you can go through, you can do laps around the rope, but if there's no attention, you know, what's the point? You're just going through a rule, you know, just fulfilling a rule, and then taking that to confession that oh, I didn't fulfill my rule, you know, and beating yourself up because you didn't go fast enough around the rope to finish the rule. Well, were you praying or not praying? And if you're praying, if you're really praying, then it doesn't matter if you fulfill the number or not. You were really praying and you were really connecting with God. And so for example, one of the things some people will do is, instead of using a number, they'll use a certain amount of time. Father Zacharias in Essex, who's written some absolutely wonderful books on the Jesus Prayer and on Father Sophrony and his tradition, made me a prayer rope with huge knots. And he said, these are really good because you can't go fast. And it's true. You can't, you know, there's only 30 knots or 33 knots in the prayer rope. But you have to go slow because it's just too unwieldy otherwise. But it's perfect for going slow. So, now, are there any questions?
You mentioned something about between the two different prayers. One, you contemplate the mysteries. I didn't know.
The rosary? Yeah. The Catholic practice of the rosary is that you say the Hail Mary, and for each rosary has 50 beads with another 10 in between, one in between each decade. And you say the Hail Mary 10 times, and you think about a certain event in the life of Christ, for example. And there's a specific number. It's a kind of a meditation. Then I think you say the Our Father before going on to the next. I was never Roman Catholic, so I don't know.
It's the Hail Mary. It's slightly different than ours, and then there's the Holy Mary, and then the Our Father.
Yeah. So there are different practices. The Divievo practice, which actually goes back to St. Seraphim, is to do the Orthodox version of the Hail Mary, Rejoice, O Virgin, 150 times. But if you look at, this is like a typical prayer rope, has a knot every 10, or it has a bead every 10. And so people say, you know, ask, especially Catholics, oh, is that where you say the Our Father or something? No, it's just like another, you treat it like another knot. But but you know, you can adapt. You can adapt your practice to, you know, to basically whatever works for you. But the most important thing is to pray, and to do so every day, morning and evening, and let that at least sanctify those times of the day, and preferably remain so that you can remain mindful of God's presence during the day. So, what else?
Well, you said whatever works for you, but how do you know that it actually works? What are they?
Do you connect with God or not? That's how you know. If you feel like you're connecting with God, which is the whole point, then something is working. And if you find yourself just reading a text or sitting there wondering what's for dinner, then it's probably not working. You need to do something else. With young guys, it's really good to keep them active. So doing prostrations is really helpful. For older people, doing prostrations is often not possible, and that's all right. It doesn't matter. But you're more likely, as when you're a bit older, to have a bit more focused attention than when you're 25 or 22.
Do you do prostrations during the Jesus prayer?
Mm-hmm.
Every time you say it, even
Some people do. It all depends on the rule that you're given. There's lots of different practices. Main thing to do is to discuss it with your spiritual father so that you come up with something that's going to work for you. The basic rule that we're given to start out with is the prayer book, morning and evening prayers, and then
Psalms.
the morning and evening prayers, which include some psalms.
But I mean,
The basic rule is the morning and evening prayers,
right.
and then it can go from there. And different monasteries and different spiritual fathers have all sorts of different things that they add to it. You know, some places add the Psalms, some places will add the Jesus prayers, others will do the canons and the Akathist and so forth, and all of that kind of thing. Depends on the spiritual father and on the person themselves. A rule of prayer is something highly personal, and it's not something you really share with anybody except your confessor.
I was going to ask about the random thoughts and you mentioned purification. So, is it the prayer that does that to sort of gets rid of those thoughts eventually, or was it a specific?
Well, in monastic practice, which also can be used for lay people, much of the time of being a novice, which is usually about 3 years, is used as preparation for a life confession. Now, the rule I was taught, you do a life confession when you become a novice. And you can be a postulant, you can be a worker, and all this kind of stuff in the monastery. But when you're clothed with a cassock and a belt, that's when you've already made a beginning commitment to the monastery. And so part of that process is to you give a life confession, but with the knowledge that you're going to do another one in a couple of years. And the point is not that you have to reconfess all those sins. The point is that you have a much better perspective on yourself and on your sins and on the things that have happened. The first confession is basically letting your spiritual father know what he's dealing with. And the second one, the life confession before tonsure, as a full monastic, is that to kind of bring closure to a whole period of repentance, which is what novitiate is, which sets you up for the next set of things that you have to deal with, which is the next deeper level. It's like peeling an onion, and it tends to be a very big onion with lots of layers, and you can get an idea of what's under the skin, but it takes a while to get to the core. So now for lay people, one of the wonderful things about conversion as an adult is the practice of a life confession when you're preparing to be baptized, and you confess before you're baptized, and the baptism essentially absolves you from all of the sins of your entire life, just like monastic tonsure absolves you from all of the sins of your previous life, so that you really are born again as a new person. That's why you get a new name, just like at baptism. It's like a second baptism, and even confession on it is considered almost like a second baptism, because it's a washing away of the sins of that you've confessed.
I noticed for several months after baptism, I didn't have any random thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Then they start creeping back.
Yep.
But maybe that's a sign that I'm not praying enough or something like that. Right?
Well, that's part of it. That's part of it. There's another aspect too. It's also grace. We wear down, as it were, the grace that's given to us. One of the reasons why it's very valuable to go to confession on a fairly frequent basis is that it helps you deal with your random thoughts, even if that's not what you've specifically confessed. For example, I noticed that I have, I know it's time to go to confession when I have all sorts of random thoughts, which doesn't mean they're necessarily sinful thoughts, but they're just kind of not under, they're not in control.
Distracting them.
They're distracting.
Right? Yeah.
They're distracting. And so going to confession with that infusion of grace really helps to keep the thoughts under control. You know, really the whole process of repentance is working from the outside in to gain greater and greater and greater control over yourself. And so the highest levels of self-control are where you can hold your mind in absolute, complete silence with no distraction.
And then
Focused and complete, intense focus on God, on the presence of God, the awareness of the presence of God. I had a friend, an elder, who would sit in that state for 10 hours a day.
wow.
That's a hesychast. You know, and only very few people can attain to that. But from that comes absolute clarity. And also from that comes total detachment. And you have no agendas for anybody except that you just overflow with love. And the people those elders who are granted clairvoyance and things like that, even if they have the gift of clairvoyance earlier than that, if they still have personal agendas, selfish agendas, they're not given a blessing to be elders, because they need to be purified of the selfish agendas. So it's a remarkable thing.
And the physical monastery helps you do that too, as well, right? Because you're you're in this.
Well,
sort
actually,
of separated from.
No, actually, the monastery is not particularly helpful to that.
Oh, really?
No, the monastery is for novices.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, the monastery is for novices, and then beyond that is the level of the skeet, where you have a disciple, an elder with a few disciples, and beyond that is the hermitage, where because a monastery is a busy place. A monastery is it's not like the name says, it's not about being alone. A monastery is about community.
Interesting.
And that means daddy 24/7, you know. And you know, they can come and knock on your door at any time.
So what is Mount Athos?
The big monasteries are all communities.
So that would be Mount Athos is a monastery.
Mount Athos is 20 different major monasteries.
Oh, I see.
With hundreds of skeets and hundreds of hermitages.
Oh.
And the hermitage is where you have an elder living either by himself or with one, maybe two others. Usually no more.
But they're all in proxy.
Designed for silence.
Oh.
And maybe with services, maybe not. There's an ancient monastic saying that the monks are the lights for the lay people and the hermits are the lights for the monks.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. And the angels are the lights for the hermits.
So what are the elders, are they more used? When you become an elder, does that mean that you're helping people more? Or?
Well, I mean, there's this, talking about the Russian tradition specifically, because in the Greek tradition, the abbot of the monastery is also called elder.
Right.
But in the Russian tradition, the starets, or elder, or starets, or in the sense of starets, is one who is given a specific obedience to serve people as a spiritual father, because he has certain he's because of his high level of spiritual maturity and because of the profundity of his gifts. There are those who don't, who have the high level of spiritual maturity, and those who have the gifts but they don't have the talent to be an elder. And quite frankly, it's a horrible job. Think about it. I mean, there's one elder that I know. He would have 400 people line up every day, starting at 6 a.m.
Yeah.
And the line would never go down until they finally shut the doors of the monastery, the gates. Father Noble with the Lavra. Then
How does he have time to do his own?
He doesn't.
That is his own.
That is his rule.
Oh.
And that is his asceticism, and it's a radical asceticism. Could you imagine?
Is he saying
Mommy for 400 people?
Doing this?
Mommy for 400 people, different people every day.
Well, that's self-denial.
It's total
Height.
radical self-denial, and there can't be any selfishness left. But I was at the Lavra and went to the early service where they still haven't opened the gates of the monastery yet. So it's at 5 o'clock in the morning in the Holy Trinity Church. And there, of course, you got St. Sergius, and his reliquary over there. The church was painted by St. Andrei Rublev, and all this, and and there are the elders all lined up. So they have half a dozen of them there.
Would they be dressed in monastic garb?
Just like regular
Not
monks.
necessarily. Okay.
Yeah. No, that you've got a schema monk on the picture of a schema monk there, don't you?
Oh. Here?
No, that was just a regular monk. You all know what the great schema looks like, right? It's basically like an epitracheon, but it's a piece of cloth that goes down and there's a hood. It's all embroidered, and it's front and goes front and back. It's the Western scapular. Only ours are embroidered.
The Western what?
Western monks call it a scapular. It's the same. It's an identical garment. Only scapular. Only they don't embroider it. And not to be confused with the little thing that people wear for like various devotions to.
So like Trappists would wear a scapular?
Trappist Benedictines.
Mm-hmm.
Trappists are a form of Benedictine Cistercian. Those are only for like in the Russian tradition. Those are only put on Sundays and feast days.
Great too.
Yeah. A schema monk might wear a skufos with a cross embroidered. Great schema cross embroidered on it. But otherwise, you'd never know. And there's a difference between the Greek use of the great schema, and the Russian use of the great schema. Or between the Greek and the Russian usages in the monastic ranks. Let's put it that way. But for the most part, they're just like I am, with a belt and a hat, rassel, and a sweater. Usually, a sweater. They're old men, What else? All right, well. So next week we'll talk about confession and what it's all about in relation to this. Because everybody has a prayer book of some kind, right? Yeah, take a look in the prayer book. Most prayer books have some kind of guided confession. So everybody take a look and You got homework.
I remember when I was baptized, I gave I was an adult, and so I gave my life confession. And then after that, I went and stayed at the monastery for 3.5 months. And I came back to Father Basil and I said, "Oh, I have to confess again. I have so much stuff I missed." And he just laughed.
Yeah. But, you know, it's amazing when you get rid of all the distractions, what you begin to see about yourself. You know, because we live very distracted lives. You know, if it's, you can't go into a store or an elevator or a restaurant, there's not music or something, or TV's on, and, you know, you turn the radio on in the car, or the iPod or iPad or whatever. So, but, and at home, there's the TVs and the radios and so forth. And how often do we take time to just be silent in a context of silence? A lot of people can't stand it. Then there's a really interesting phenomenon, which I'd never thought of before until I encountered it, is that some people are afraid to not think. They're afraid to silence their mind. You know, it's the Kantian lie. I think, therefore I am. Therefore, if you're not thinking, therefore you don't exist. Well, it's not true.
But if you're not thinking, then how do you know you're focusing on God or communing with God?
Because it's a deeper consciousness than thinking. It's a deeper level of awareness.
It's the news.
Yeah, it's the spiritual awareness.
Right.
But it also, and you also understand with your rational mind that this is what's happening.
So that's still aware.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You don't shut out your awareness. You just focus your awareness. It's deeply focused attention. And again, it's all about synergy. It's not shutting off the mind. It's working together. It's the mind and the spirit working together. Or the mind and the heart working together.
So you're focusing your attention on silence.
Or on God.
Quiet. What's that?
On God.
Right.
Like Buddhist meditation, you're focusing it on whatever is present. And it's very different. So you become profoundly, the idea of Buddhist meditation is that you become profoundly aware of everything that's going on. So it makes nice poetry, you know. But in Christian hesychast meditation, you focus your awareness on God and the presence of God.
So you're giving away sort of your own, like, will, or
no, you're detaching from your ego.
Detaching from your ego.
Yeah, there's a long. I could do a whole course on ascetic theology, but it's all about detachment from the ego. Okay. All right. Let's pray. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, without corruption, the gave birth to God, the Word, true Theotokos, and magnified thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, to ages of ages.
Amen.
Yes,